Hello again, and welcome to another episode of TIO Talks. My name's Warwick Powell. My guest today is Philip Pilkington. I've spoken to Philip a couple of times in the past, mainly around his economics research, and Philip is the author of a book called The Collapse of Global Liberalism. That, however, is not the main subject of our discussion today. I've asked Philip to join us because Philip's been doing some very interesting work with a co-author around philosophical bridges between civilizations and has recently published a two-part piece looking at Hegel in particular and how Hegel opens up a way in which the West can engage with China in particular. And on the back of that, Philip spent a little bit of time in China recently. Welcome to the show, Philip.
Thanks for having me again, Mark.
It's great to see you. Look, the last time we caught up in Budapest, we did have a bit of a chat around some of these issues. And I guess one of the things that we find in a place like Budapest in Hungary is a sense of it being a bridge or a connector that opens up a way in which people from different civilizations, particularly across the Eurasian continent, can actually find ways of talking to each other, not just at each other. Perhaps you could just give us a bit of a run through of the papers that you've published recently around this theme, and what are the key threads in it, and what motivated you, I guess, to begin this particular journey, given the fact that your background was in economics, finance, and investment.
Yeah, well, I think we come from actually kind of similar backgrounds. And actually, we were just talking before we started recording, and I was going to say that we have very similar backgrounds from reading kind of philosophy stuff and everything. I too, in my 20s, kind of was really interested in this stuff before. Well, I was doing economics at the same time, but I was reading a lot of this stuff. You said you were teaching it. I was reading a lot of it while I was doing the kind of boring economic stuff, and then I went into finance, and then eventually I ended up here. So my familiarity is as well kind of as an interested person who maybe considered doing a philosophy degree once upon a time, but then the crushing realities of the world and practicalities prevented me from realizing my dream. The Budapest connection, I think, to start with that, is completely contingent in a sense. Budapest is not historically somewhere of cross-civilizational dialogue. I mean, the most you could say is that the Magyar people are Asiatic in some sense. They use the Chinese reversal from a Western perspective of names, for example. We're not really sure where they came from. We think they're Uralic. They might go to Mongolia or something. But this is really ancient history stuff, and it's good for a diplomatic event. But let's be honest, it's not having any practical outcome on this. The reason that Hungary has become the potential for cross-civilizational dialogue is because Hungary has had a very bad experience in the 20th century of bloc formation. Every time there's serious conflict between the West and the East, and I'm counting Russia in the East at the moment, just for practicality's sake, I don't think it's actually in the East, but the West and the East, anytime there's conflict in the Cold War, or during the period of warfare and the interwar period of the Second World War, Hungary's a loser because of its geographic position, because it is kind of actually between West and East. We call it Central Europe here, and it is kind of Central Europe. It's not quite East Europe. So Hungary has to, from a practical geopolitical point of view, make sure, to the best of its ability, that bloc formation does not occur. Now, obviously, it's a small country of 10 million people or so it doesn't have the power to determine that. But I think what the Hungarian government has woken up to is that they do have the power, and they do have the attractiveness, because it's quite an intellectually diverse place, to attract people who are willing to talk about those kind of things, and also to make that an official position of the government. And by the way, the government here is a bit of a philosopher king government. It's very intellectual. I mean, Orban himself is a Scruton student. He's obsessed with reading philosophy and so on. A lot of the people in Fidesz are like that. Even though they're portrayed as kind of knuckle draggers in the Western press, it's always the opposite of the truth with the creepos in the West these days, the liberals. But so that's basically the Budapest foundation of it. I think we're kind of creating the tradition of cross-civilizational dialogues rather than falling back on anything. But I do think this is the place to be for that. For those geopolitical reasons. Those are not going away in the next decade or two. So I think it probably will take hold here. Why did Why did we want to do it? It's my co-author and I, David Dusenberry. He used to be a fellow here at the Danube Institute. He's gone back. He's an associate professor at the University of Florida at the moment, but he has a strong Budapest connection. He was here for, I think, about 5 years. And he's a bit of a world traveler. I think he'd lived in Asia at some point. You'd have to ask him about that. But he basically we kind of came to the conclusion that this was absolutely inevitable. The post-liberals in the West, they're mainly in the United States, we might as well be honest, are not warlike people. Let's put it that way. They're mostly Catholics. At the very least, they're Christians, and they're pretty serious Christians. They're not these kind of people who call themselves Christians and then wave around a flag calling for war and conflict, completely eliminating all the teachings of the New Testament. They're actual Christians who don't actually like violence and conflict, and so temperamentally, they're not really flag waggers and people who want conflicts with other civilizations. But on the other hand, apart from maybe Adrian Vermeule, the Harvard professor who does common good constitutionalism, I don't think there's been a great deal of thought given to the cross-civilizational question. I think there's more sympathy in that group for cross-civilizational dialogue than in other intellectual groups, in neoconservative groups. Obviously, the liberals once upon a time wanted cross-civilizational dialogue, but then we realized liberalism was some sort of an imperialist philosophy that wants everybody to be like them. So I think it's the kind of one remaining cross-civilizational dialogue venue for cross-civilizational dialogue. Now, I don't think that's actually a coincidence, because I note the strong Catholic element in the post-liberal movement. It's very strong. I mean, if you find post-liberal Protestants, there are some. I just did a podcast with some of them last week in the Theopolis Institute. They're not Puritans, let's put it that way. They're people who take the Catholic criticisms quite seriously and so on of the Protestant ideology. And the thing to say about Catholicism, and we'll probably get into it more as we talk, is that the cross-civilizational dialogue that did take place between China and the West was via the Catholic Church. It was by the Jesuit missionaries, people like Matteo Ricci and so on in the early modern period. And that's not a coincidence. The Catholic Church has always been a bit of an inclusive organization. Yes, of course, it wants everybody to subscribe to the one true faith as they see it, but the Catholic Church is very reticent to go in and destroy civilizational aspects. So if you go to Catholic countries around the world, they look very different. They all have Catholic churches, they all have the cross, but they look very different, and that's a very conscious choice on the part of the Catholic Church. So all those things suggest that it's not that coincidental that the kind of more post-liberal people are moving in this direction. But even beyond that, it's just a necessity in the world. We're returning to civilizational powers in the world today. And that's just a reality. There's no getting around that. They're not going away, even if people wanted it to. Now, I don't particularly want it to. I don't see a problem with having multiple civilizations in the world. But even if you wanted a homogenous liberal global order or something that these Fukuyamites and so on wanted, it's not happening. So, get real. So we're going to have to talk to each other, or we're going to end up it's either that or we eliminate humanity via nuclear war, which is a possibility, I guess. But either one of the other things is going to happen. And we can have hostile dialogue, sure, but then everyone's like, that's not going to be good. So we probably want positive dialogue just on a purely pragmatic level. But to my mind, and I think David would agree with me, we think there's actually a lot of positive aspects of cross-civilizational dialogue. The Chinese-Western dialogue, for example, that we wrote about in our first Hungarian conservative article, has been extremely fruitful in the early modern period. You can't really understand Europe after the early modern period, effectively after the Reformation and Counter-Reformation, without understanding the Chinese influence on Europe. It was absolutely enormous. And some of it's tied to Enlightenment thinking, and I think David and I don't think some of the interpretations were great. We can go into that. But not all of it. I mean, and actually not most of it. So if you kind of go to somebody in the West right now who kind of wants to return Western civilization to its roots and everything like that, they probably have in mind a lot of things that actually have kind of Chinese aesthetics built into them. Like the Palace of Versailles extensive Chinese aesthetics built into it. Or if you kind of the one of the examples that I always give is I'm Irish, but I grew up in quite an Anglo. I'm Catholic, but I did grow up in kind of an Anglo household in a sense, and I always remember going to my grandparents' house for kind of Sunday tea. And you think of that as kind of Anglo-ish or British or something like that, but it's not. You're serving a Chinese beverage in Chinese fine porcelain. So you're kind of like, okay, so all these people are saying, well, we want to return to this kind of, more grounded culture and stuff like that. Yeah, okay, but look at it a little bit, and you'll see that there's an awful lot of Chinese influence, not even a little bit. And then you go and you start thinking beyond aesthetics, and you think about some of the ideas that have come about since the early modern period, and they're massively influenced by China as well. Sometimes at a second order degree. For example, the economics, our sphere in a sense, grows out of Francois Quesnay, which David has pointed out to me. The physiocratic principles were not based on European feudal society. They were based on reports coming from China. The entire physiocratic system was obviously Quesnay never had any immediate exposure to the Chinese economy, but he had good reports of it from probably mainly Jesuit missionaries, and he formed the physiocratic principles out of that. So modern economics is born out of Western observations of China. This is just one. I mean, there's probably a whole research program to be done here. But the moment you put your rod into the pond, like multiple fish seem to bite. So yeah, so it's an inevitability. So I guess that's kind of the other thing, that if we want to return to a more grounded Western civilization, in a sense, we're going to find that there's an awful lot of China there, and has been for about half a millennium.
So partly your story, I think, is that a rejuvenation of Western civilization in a broad sense actually presupposes its ability to actually understand the role of Chinese civilization in its own history, number one. But in doing that, it also presupposes a recognition that Chinese civilization has a legitimacy as part of the broader tapestry of humanity and human history, which is a very different way of thinking about different civilizations. Instead of viewing them as places to conquer and to save their souls, they're actually viewing them as places from which one learns and one in which one engages in dialogue. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, although I mean, I think part of this, I'd hope that we'd argue that some of here's a controversial take, but it's one that I'm continuously coming away with. The reaction in the West to the history of colonialism, mainly to the history of the British Empire, has been a kind of post-colonialism. We all know what that means. It comes out of broadly left-wing ideas, somewhat Marxist, etc., etc. And you'll find it grew up mainly in British universities, would be my reading, Oxford, SOAS, these kind of places. And a lot of what they were saying, I'm kind of sympathetic to. So the excesses of imperialism and so on are very real. I mean, I'm not British, again, I'm Irish, so we know all about that. So I'm kind of sympathetic in one sense, but in another sense, I always came to the conclusion that post-colonialism itself was Western. Like it was, it's this weird paradox where it's saying, well, haven't we been so bad in the way that we've treated the rest of the world? But we're saying it in a kind of Western register. And I think in late liberalism, as I call it in my book, I think that's becoming increasingly clear. The post-colonialism can kind of be imperialist. I think people are starting to actually recognize that now. But I've never been that surprised by that. And post-colonialism has tended to it's tended in a very Manichean direction, where it says that all intercourse between the West and the rest of the world was imperialist. And I don't think that's true. I think a lot of it was. A lot of the commercial activity and so on was. But just for example, what you said about the saving of souls, I mean, if you go back and you look at the interactions between the Jesuits and the Chinese, this was not one way. I mean, yes, of course, the Jesuits were there to try and convert China. They failed. But it wasn't just about that. There was a lot of two-way communication. And again, I don't think the Jesuits were there to impose a Western system of governance or Western aesthetics or to take away anything cultural beyond what they saw as paganistic. And maybe that's wrong, maybe that's right. I'm not judging it. But I'm just pointing out that an awful lot of the time, they were not the issue. The issue was mainly commercial and governmental from an imperialist point of view. So I think we're going to see a lot of that again, that if there's a lot of intercourse between the civilizations, it'll be cross flow, but it'll be coming from places where the ideas themselves are, there is a formation. It's not completely relativistic. I think sometimes the post-colonial studies tend in this relativistic direction. And then, as we saw, especially post-Obama, the mask drops from that, and you see kind of like, oh, this is another power play, actually. A lot of these ideas are being used to stir up, for example, color revolutions, or to criticize other people's civilizations for not embracing X, Y, and Z that we've embraced in the West, and so on. Whereas an actual dialogue, I do think the best model we have is the Jesuits in China. And maybe people won't think that's perfect, but I mean, the Jesuits were there teaching the Chinese some of the best aspects of Western science. There's still, Matteo Ricci's grave is still kind of honored in China, not because of the Christian or Catholic influence, which I think people are still a little bit suspicious of, for good reason. In the 19th century, Christianity was used for espionage in China, I know that, and it's true. But they don't venerate it for that, but they do recognize that Ricci brought Western science and that this was a big advancement for the Chinese. On the other hand, there were these reports going back to Europe, which, as I said, influenced enormous amounts of aesthetics, economics, science, everything. So I think this kind of two-way street is going to come about. But I actually think part of it is that we have to kind of shake a lot of that post-colonial studies stuff. And I think some of that, actually, on my trip to China, I noticed some of that has sunk in. And I fully understand why it's sunk in. I want to be clear about that, because a lot, like 80% of what it's saying is true. But the 20% that isn't true, I think could actually be quite damaging, because it does set up a sort of a Manichaean dualism there, where oh, if one of us touches the other, we'll get infected by colonialism or imperialism. I think there's a little bit of quarantining going on there that we might have to get over.
Yeah, look, one of the interesting things coming from China itself is, of course, the recent civilizational initiatives, the global civilizational initiatives, as part of that suite of civilizational development, security, and governance initiatives, which aims to, I guess, open up spaces in which China can think about itself. Because part of this issue of civilizational dialogue is actually to think about yourself as much as it is to think about the other. Because without knowing yourself, it's kind of difficult to have a dialogue. And so China, in a sense, is in some respects refashioning and rediscovering itself, and it has been doing that increasingly over the last, say, 15 to 20 years. And again, on all of those dimensions you've touched on: aesthetics, culture, even the reappropriation in modern ways of Chinese classics. So there's this whole sort of move to re-understand China through 21st century lenses, which I guess coincides with the work that you've started doing, which is to think about the Western civilization, how it touched China and vice versa, and how those experiences can reopen up a 21st century portal, shall we say, that enables this two-way dialogue to take place again.
Yeah, so I've been to China twice now, and this year, I mean, I've been fairly regular at this point, but the first time I went, I saw that China was in this process of questioning who it was, in a sense, and it's really profound, and people talk about it quite openly, like intellectuals. If you meet academics and stuff, they talk about this very openly in a way that I found surprising the first time I went there, and then I told David about this. And when we went, I think he was like, "Oh wow, I didn't get this. This is not subtle. This is not like people are genuinely saying like, what are we going to be? And the reason for that, to my mind, is quite obvious. That obviously the contemporary Chinese state is founded on Marxist principles, and Marxism is effectively a critique. And like Marx would say the same thing. I don't think Marx would disagree with me. He famously said he didn't want to have cookshops for the future or anything like that. So you can't really you can base a revolution on a critique, there's no doubt about that, but you can't base a civilization on a critique. It wouldn't really make sense. And I think that's why a lot of the Marxist regimes ran into a brick wall. The Chinese have come to understand that. And so they're now in the process of saying, okay, well, what are we returning to? And they've got a 5,000-year-old civilization to return to. So it's not really that surprising that they move in that direction. But you're right, you can't really have a dialogue if you don't really understand yourself. And right now, China and the West are in the same position. And they're in the same position for very, very different reasons. The West is in this position because it's decivilized, in a sense. That's what David and I are arguing. And we're not the only ones to say this. In fact, David pulled the quote of decivilization from Emmanuel Macron, of all people. So there's a growing awareness that the West has lost its way into vacuous liberal fads, and it's not a way to govern a society. It's not functional. And so the West has two options before it: either re-civilize us in some way. That is, it goes back in some sense to its roots, which are mostly the classics and the New Testament tradition, basically. I mean, and the Old Testament tradition behind that, of course. That's basically where it'll have to go, unless it wants to recreate some new civilization. But we've heard that story before. A little philosopher called Friedrich Nietzsche told us that it was going to happen in the late 19th century. A couple of guys tried it; it didn't work out so well. So I don't believe in that Nietzschean And anyway, when he was talking about all his new civilization stuff, he was just drawing on the Greeks anyway. So the whole thing, we could talk about Nietzsche all day. But the point is that didn't go anywhere in the 20th century. So it seems to me much more likely that either the path open is some sort of re-civilization in some shape or form, or the West is going to collapse. And I don't have a firm opinion on that. The West could collapse. There's a lot of indications that it could. But the optimistic reading is that even if it goes through a minor collapse or some sort of cyclical collapse or something, that it'll end up by hook or by crook re-civilizing. So the West is here because we picked up a really vacuous ideology that's really hollowed out our culture and our societies, especially over the last 30 years. China's in the position for a different reason. Well, sort of similar. I mean, it picked up a Western, somewhat critical negative philosophy and changed an awful lot as a society over the course of the revolutionary period. It consolidated that, obviously, under the opening up period of Deng. And since then, it's been trying to put everything back together. Now, my argument would be, despite the amount of turmoil that the revolutionary period caused in China, it actually wasn't that deep. For the most part, China was still China, right? So, you could go to China at any point, even during the Cultural Revolution, and my guess is people were kind of still pretty Chinese, and they were kind of still living like Chinese people had lived for a very long time. In the West, the roots have been dug up much more than in China. That's very striking when you go there. China still really is China. I don't think the revolutionary period's changed it that much. Whereas in the West, the root has been dug up. So China actually has an easier job, to my mind, re-civilizing than the West. And that in itself provides a really interesting opportunity, because the West might end up having to figure out how to re-civilize by emulating China in some sense. Not in every way, but in some ways, because China has a lot more low-hanging fruit to re-civilize itself. And then you're on to the next interesting point, which is the Western influence on China, which is the revolutionary period in China. So obviously I've referred before that in the early modern period there was a lot of dialogue. And the West had a big impact on China, mainly in the realm of science. But even though Christianity never took hold in China fully, it did have quite a big influence. So the emperors would have Jesuits as part of their wise men. Now they'd be one in a handful or 1 in 12, but they always heard them out. So they were always listened to. Unlike in Japan they crucified the Jesuits when they went there. They didn't want to listen at all. But the Chinese always listened. So I don't want to say that there was no influence, no cultural influence. Scientific influence, definitely. Cultural influence, that needs more work. It's an interesting question how much cultural impact the Jesuits had in China that I don't know the answer to. But clearly, it didn't transform the country. The Marxist ideas did transform the country, not fully, as I've said. I don't think that the impact on Chinese culture was as profound as liberalism's had on the Western culture, but it did impact it massively. And the at least the nominal position of the current Chinese state is still that it's a Marxist state. That is really, really interesting to me because I think that China has imported a bunch of Western ideas, kind of distorted Western ideas. These are classical Western ideas that come mainly out of the Christian tradition, not so much out of the classics. And China's adopted them. I'll just give one example. I thought of this independently, and we actually wrote about it separately, but we hadn't published it. And last time we were in China, there was a Western classics scholar there, a Chinese woman, and she actually brought up in the Q&A to our lectures that Marxism had introduced the concept of linear time into Chinese society. Prior to that, she said, China had basically a cyclical view of time, much as the Western, what we call the Western pagan tradition, Western classical tradition, had. They thought that the universe was permanent and cyclical. And the New Testament and Old Testament, to some extent, introduces a linear progression of time, a start and an end point, and an eschatology and so on. And she said, this has been imported into China. The Chinese now, although it's still very Chinese, they think in linear terms. That's really interesting. So there are these components of Western thought, and that's just a big idea, but it's one that really has an impact on how people conceive of themselves, that have now sunk into Chinese culture. And the Chinese will have to ask, do we want to get rid of that? My sense is they probably don't. A linear view of history is not a bad way of looking at the world. I mean, maybe somebody can come and say that it's not the best or something like that. But, I don't get any sense that anyone in China says, well, we want to return to our cultural traditions, maybe some of the Confucian ethics and so on. Yes, people are thinking about that. But if you say, do you want to go back to a cyclical view of time? I don't think many people are on board with that. So that's only my sense now. I don't know. Maybe there are loads of people who are pushing for cyclical theories of time. But the point is that there are these imported aspects of Western, I would say Western Christian culture, these are not even Western classical or pagan authors, that have now become solidified in Chinese culture. And the Chinese are going to have to ask themselves, do they want to completely get rid of that, which they might, or do they want to continue looking at that? And I think that's where the figure of Hegel comes in, that there has actually been a massive influence of Hegel, which Hegel is, in effect, a secularized Christian philosopher, and we can talk about that more if you'd like, and that his ideas via Marx have become very embedded in, if not in Chinese society at large, I'm not sure about that. I don't speak Chinese, so I can't interact with most people there, but definitely on the educated public and on the governmental class, these ideas have had a huge impact.
Yeah, look, I think one of the interesting things about this idea of linearity is the idea of telos, right? So there is a tradition coming out of the West that history is teleological, it's heading somewhere, that there is an endpoint, whether it's a good or a bad endpoint, but it is heading somewhere. And in some regards, I think that the influence of that particular perspective came through, of course, through a very Marxist lens, which is that history is unfolding in a particular way towards a certain end outcome, in this case, communism. But whilst that remains official canon, in a lot of ways, the idea that we really just exist ontologically in episodes of change and flux, where change is actually what goes on and there is no endpoint per se, seems to be actually a more dominant practical attitude towards the world rather than there being an obvious telos. But going back to the Hegel stuff, you do, in a sense, use Hegel as a way in which you open up the dialogue from the other way, don't you? Right? As you've touched on, that Hegel via Marx opened up a particular influence into the Chinese cosmology, if you will, a modern cosmology. Perhaps you could just sort of dive into that a little bit more and explain how you think that particular avenue of exploration might bear some fruit in terms of tackling this question of cross-civilizational dialogue?
Well, there's two aspects to this. So the first aspect is what I'd say are maybe the better parts of Hegel, and I think we've kind of discussed them. It's a teleological notion of history. There might be actually a great deal of value in that, even if you're not, say, a believing Christian or something like that. There may actually be something to a teleological view of history that motivates societies to make progress, frankly. I don't know if that's true, but I could see why it might be true, and I think that there should be a broader discussion on that. Actually, my co-author David is more sympathetic to Hegel than I am, and you should get the sympathetic view from him. We joke that he's the good cop on Hegel, and I'm the kind of bad cop on Hegel, and I think there's a little bit of truth to that. So I gave a lecture at four venues, I think, while I was over there, three universities and a think tank or something. No, it was two think tanks and two universities. And my one was on Hegel. David's was on Fukuyama and Koyev, who are Hegelians, obviously, so they're very interrelated lectures. And we'll be publishing these versions of these as co-authored because they're kind of works in progress or whatever. But my basic my sort of warning to the Chinese on the Hegelian tradition is that Marx is pretty honest that his is a critical philosophy. There's no mystification there, and he's quite explicit about it. Hegel is not does not claim to be a critical ideology, not purely anyway. It claims to be a constructive ideology, and for example, the philosophy of right, Hegel's most mature political philosophical work, claims to be a philosophical blueprint of the perfect state. It also means, in German, it kind of means philosophy of law in a sense. But in the German tradition, Enlightenment tradition, of course, law is embodied in the state and so on. So it's effectively a blueprint for the perfect state. At least that's what Hegel's saying. And as I pointed out in the lecture, Marx's first political work is his critique of the philosophy of right. Before that, he writes his dissertation on Democritus, I think, the Greek materialist tradition, which has an impact, obviously, but it's a little hard to grasp. And he also writes something on Schelling, the romantic German philosopher. But again, it's a slightly juvenile. I mean, I think his points might even be good on Schelling. Schelling is kind of a mystification, but he's kind of juvenile and attacking his idols in a sense. And the first time he writes a kind of constructive a piece of political philosophy is his critique of the philosophy of right, which is rightly quite famous in Marxist circles, although it's become kind of boiled down to the turning Hegel on its head quote, and it's actually much richer than that, in my opinion. But basically, my issue is that, and what I was trying to make the case in the lecture, is that Hegel's philosophy of right is very Enlightenment. I would say Enlightenment liberal, in a sense. It's probably one of the best statements of liberalism, the most convincing statement of Enlightenment liberalism, but I think ultimately it is still Enlightenment liberalism. And the issue with Enlightenment liberalism is that to my mind, it's a very procedural philosophy. It's quite hollow. I think this comes, you see it much more visibly in Kant. Like I think we said before we started recording, Kantian ethics are very insubstantial. They're very, very abstract. And there's this kind of, I call it a kind of fetishization of abstraction in the Enlightenment thinkers, especially the German ones, who I like quite a lot in a strange way, because I kind of grew up with them. But it's very abstract, and I'd say it's very formalistic, and it's very empty. And my criticism of Hegel's philosophy of right is that it's kind of the same thing. You can never actually find any advice to a prince in Hegel's philosophy of right. So if you read the old tradition, the classics tradition on political philosophy, or ethics, Nicomachean ethics, maybe in Aristotle, or you go to the medieval tradition out of Thomas Aquinas, or you even go to the Renaissance tradition, Machiavelli and so on. Machiavelli's a little bit of a funny one, but that whole tradition, you'll find actual advice. Here's what you should do concretely in this. Wisdom. It's like there is wisdom in these pages. Whether they can apply directly today, open question. But there's wisdom there. There's actual substance. You won't find any of that in the philosophy of right. You won't find any of that in Hegel. Hegel will never really tell you how to have a good society. He'll only speak in these very abstract formal ways. And it's a very enlightenment, and I would say very liberal way of thinking. So I think my main message out of Hegel is that Hegel has become almost embedded in China via Marx. But you won't find any, when you dig right down to the bottom, you won't find anything. It's not even turtles all the way down. You
No.
just past turtle number 3, there's just nothing. It's an empty void. And so my argument is that the Chinese are going to have to fill that void with their own, what I call, natural law tradition.
Well, they're filling it in many regards through a very typical Chinese move, which is a synthesis of a diverse range of thinking, which, of course, in a Western sense, they would see these different threads often in contradiction with each other, whether it's the Maoists or the legalists, Confucian traditions, etc., etc. But in fact, what governance tends to do in China is appropriate and transcend difference to create new syntheses that are relevant for the moment. And so you find these different periods where different elements of the traditions, and there are quite a few traditions, gain emphasis. There is another tradition actually in the German Enlightenment space, which I think is probably worthwhile and perhaps one that you and your co author might have a look at one day, and that was the tradition of Pufendorf, Samuel Pufendorf, and Christian Thomasius. They were engaged on the other side of the fight to deal with the fragmentation of the German state after the 30-Year War. And they were much more practical in terms of the advices that they were dishing out. But in the long run, the sort of abstract liberal tradition, I guess, tended to prevail. But it might be one worth digging into, because it is a more grounded sense of practicalities. How does a state deal with the fragmentation and to rebuild cohesion, given the deep conflicts that exist in society, and what needs to be done in terms of the secularization of a confessional state, for example? Very, very practical. Certainly not what you'd find in Hegel. So, what was the reception to these messages that you went to China, participated in these forums, delivered some talks? What were the issues that were coming back at you that really said to you, this is worth digging into more? There is fruit to be picked if we explored this more.
People were fascinated by it. I mean, the Chinese are extremely well educated on the West, but it feels to me. Here's the way it feels in China, and I might not be getting this right, but like a good Jesuit who went over for 2 weeks and picked up a kind of diary and wrote back a slightly misleading version. Maybe it's interesting in and of itself. It feels like to me that the Chinese basically had to put back together their education system after the Cultural Revolution. And what they had to do, number one, was establish a sort of battery of knowledge. And you might just think of that as a giant library in a sense. They just had to know everything again, right? We had to just figure out like everything in a sense, from scientific training to the history of China itself, and then later on maybe try and figure out what we used to know about the West and so on. So I think the first generation had to basically put together this battery of knowledge in a sense, and I think that just really required like archival research, the kind of really basic primary source sort of stuff. And then the next generation, which I think are basically the people who are still alive, right? They'd be the baby boomer version in China or something like that, began to actually articulate some of these things. And so you'll find that you'll have a very, very good specialist on the classical tradition in the West, or you'll have a very good specialist on Hegel. But I think now the next generation of Chinese need to figure out what to do with all this knowledge, if you see what I mean. And I think that's why it's such, I mean, there's a million different reasons it's a fruitful time to talk about this, but from a purely intellectual point of view, I think that's what is so fascinating. when we go over and give these talks, that the West, for all its faults, still produces some, not many, but still produces some intellectuals who can actually apply the theory in a sense, like actually say, well, here's what Hegel means today. I mean, even if you take a figure like Fukuyama, not a fan, we've just written a very critical article on Fukuyama, but hats off to the guy for figuring out how to bring Hegel and Koyev into the unipolar moment and make it kind of what the kids would call a meme today, right? Like that's the kind of a skill in and of itself, even if you think it's a little bit of shallow reading or anything like that. And it feels to me like the Chinese are now at that point where they need to figure out how to, and this is both the Western ideas and their Chinese ideas, they need to figure out how to actualize them and turn them into a kind of a living, breathing set of ideas that actually have an impact on society. Interestingly, at the same time in the West, we've become oversaturated with ideas. We're in the kind of postmodern, almost Baudrillardian simulation moment where we have so many ideas floating around that you can propose a really clever interpretation and like it just gets thrown into the shopping cart with all the rest of the interpretations, and it's just interpretations piled up on each other. And that's a decadence setting in the West. That's the collapse of our culture. Clearly, it's not able to sort the good from the bad in those terms. But China doesn't suffer from that. It suffers from, well, it doesn't, I wouldn't even call it suffering, but it's at a moment where it needs to figure out how to actualize those ideas. So when we go over and give a talk on Koyev or Hegel, people will come up to us. We'll have very specific discussions, obviously, as well about certain aspects and linear views of time and so on. But the broad comment that we get is, "Oh, now we have to make these things alive." It's so refreshing to hear the Marxist Hegelian debate taken out of a classroom where it's sort of discussed in sometimes ideological terms, Marx versus Hegel, but even when you get away from the ideological battle, it's talked about in very, very an academic, almost archival sense. And when you bring that down and you say, well, here's what that has to say about the Chinese attempts to come to terms with their own history, for example, or to integrate aspects of Western thought into their history as they've done, that's very, very refreshing to people. I think there's plenty of talent in China to do it itself. I don't think that Westerners need to come in and lay down the law on this part. I don't think that's our job at all. Wouldn't want it to be. I think there's lots of intellectual ferment going on there, and I think there's a lot of people who have already kind of figured out how to do this. But it's a combination of the fact that that's only beginning that makes it interesting. Also, that there are Western ideas there that I think Westerners like David and I probably actually are a little bit more familiar with than the Chinese. They're more familiar with Chinese ideas. We're more familiar with Western ideas, at least in a broad sense. I'm sure there are Hegel scholars in China who've read more Hegel than me, sure. But I mean in a broad sense of where it fits in the general political culture and so on. So, there's a very fruitful moment there that's just kind of organically generated itself. And it seems like, I mean, not to put it in too crude terms, but you get a lot of bang for your buck with ideas these days in China, it seems to me.
In terms of this two-way dialogue, let's, in a sense, wind it back to how we started this conversation, which was around the Jesuits and the ways in which information and knowledge was exchanged. These experiences that you've had are really only the beginning of a process, not only for yourselves as individuals, but perhaps arguably as agents of history, so to speak. Which things are you particularly keyed in on from a Western re-civilization perspective, if you will, that you think you can draw from through your interactions with the Chinese intelligentsia, who are also grappling with these sorts of questions? What can the West learn through these engagements to give itself greater clarity around what the West was, and perhaps more to the point, what the West could be?
So I'll be very practical on this and not talk about the intellectual aspects, which are fascinating, but at the end of the day, this isn't a purely academic project, it's somewhat political, and so we might as well just call it what it is for a few moments and be quite pragmatic about this. I'll just say very briefly what the West can say to China about this process. It can say what not to do. That is valuable. Trust me, that is valuable. That is even valuable from me coming from America, Ireland, and Britain, where I lived for most of my life, and coming to Hungary and just warning them of what can happen if you go down the wrong path. So I definitely get the sense that the Chinese just do not understand how where the West is right now, and how you can go down that route if you're not careful. Now, their instincts are tuned that I don't think they would go down that route. But I think that there is something to learn there on the part of China. In terms of what the West has to learn from China, China's clearly going to create a functional governance structure for the 21st century before the West. I mean, that's clear. It may have already done so, actually. I don't just mean that in terms of structure of governance. I mean, in theory, the West could remain, could create some sort of a post-liberal, re-civilized West that continued to have parliamentary democracy or something like that. I don't even think those questions are that interesting in a sense. But I mean governance rather than government. You know, how you actually manage a mass society that isn't liberal. We've never actually had that before. I mean, I argue in my book, obviously, that liberalism only really gets its claws into the West in the 90s. It had its claws in the intellectual class for a lot longer, but it only really, you know, got down to the root in the 90s and 2000s. And I think that's true. But at the same time, all of those attempts to form a mass society from the, well, I'd argue from the English Civil War, but at least from the French Revolution on, were in some sense an attempt to form a liberal society. And the communist stuff was somewhat similar, actually. It was just also trying to get rid of some of the aspects of the economy. But ultimately, the view was still this maximized autonomous subject. You read, this is where you will get a kind of the thing from Marx about fishing in the morning and blah blah blah. But it was all about like maximizing autonomy and stuff like that. So all these attempts at forming a mass society that the West has attempted to do have been, in some sense, liberal. China is forming a mass society on a non-liberal model. It's already doing that, and it's being quite successful as far as I'm concerned. So I think the West is going to have to learn what that means. And I mean that at a very practical level. I mean that in how businesses are run, what the relationship is between businesses and the state, for example. I think China is learning a lot of lessons on that right now. Social media regulation is a really obvious low-hanging fruit. Money creation, all these things that if I'm right and the liberal project has effectively failed, which I think it has, then we're going to need some sort of a post-liberal mode of governance, and maybe government too, but governance certainly primarily. And I think China's just going to figure that out before we do. And so I think on the practical tools-based level, as in the tools of governance, from laws to regulations, all these things, how you enculturate a culture as well, how you support that without letting capitalism just absolutely eviscerate the culture and turn it into consumerism, which it will do if it's left to itself. We know that. We can say that in the West. There's no doubt about that. China's going to figure out that before we do. I'm pretty confident on that. And I think the West is ultimately going to have to learn these modes of governance from China. But again, just quickly to go back to the early modern period, there was a lot of enthusiasm to learn about how to do governance in China. The entire early modern period, right into Enlightenment, people that I'm not a huge fan of, like Voltaire and so on, all of them agreed, from the Jesuits, you know, the most religious Jesuit, to the great atheist Voltaire, they all agreed that the Chinese had governance down better than the West. This was just widely acknowledged. And before the break, I would call it the break to imperialism and the century of humiliation and so on. And that's when relations just fell apart and the West got really arrogant, and we know that story. But before that, it was consensus that the Chinese were better at governance. And nobody even questioned why this was. You'd think, like, if you, again, I don't want to beat up on the post-colonial guys too much, but you'd think if you went to a post-colonial study that you'd get, like, Jesuits saying, oh, these people can't run themselves, they're pagans. No, the Jesuits say these people are much better governance than we are. We have a lot to learn from them. And it was just obvious to people why this was. It was a 5,000-year-old civilization. It was huge. It was big. It was old. It was very impressive. and we had something to learn from it. So it's not really surprising that we get back to that. Ultimately, China is an older civilization. Its history of governance outside of the period, the century of humiliation, and obviously then there was the revolutionary period, which is a very different thing. You're not going to get good governance in a revolution. Like, show me one revolution where they immediately come up with good governance. It's not that surprising from a longue durée historical point of view to think that we end up going back to China to learn about good governance. And with all these new technological and economic and financial developments, it's even more of a challenge. So I think that China is going to teach the rest of the world how to govern in the post-liberal moment. That does not mean, because somebody will take that clip and bash me and say I'm trying to sinicize the world. I don't mean sinicization by that. I just mean the practical tools. The actual culture could look completely different. And that was how the early moderns thought about it as well. They said, well, we'd love to learn some of these things. Like the Jesuits didn't want to bring Confucius to the West. They wanted the West to be Catholic, obviously. They were Jesuits. But they just were interested in the tools of governance. And I think those things the West is going to learn from China in the post-liberal 21st century.
Well, if liberalism was a universalizing project, post-liberalism, if it is to become anything, going to be the opposite. What
Yep.
for you in this particular exploration and journey and dialogue and interactions are the next touch points? What signposts are you guiding your work by, and where to next, I guess?
I think we need to broaden out beyond David and I. I mean, effectively, we're the only two people doing this, really. Actually, a colleague here at Daniel Institute, Eric Hendricks, came over for some of the dialogues, and he speaks Chinese and stuff. He's actually he's a real kind of Chinese scholar. So I guess we'd include Eric in it too. But this has really been a kind of an entrepreneurial venture on our part. So I think we're going to write our articles, and we'll see where that goes. We're going to write a book on it as well. We're going to turn these articles into a book. That's one of the plans. But ultimately, that's all very interesting, and people can read it. But it doesn't mean that much if we can't get the actual dialogue going, and that requires events and conferences and so on. And I think that's where we need to move. Now, as I said, there's a lot of support for that in Budapest. So I think this is going to be ground zero. But that doesn't mean that everything will take place in Budapest. It just means that this might end up being the logical meeting point for West and East. But obviously then we'd hope that it would spin off into other discussions that some of them take place in the West and some of them take place in China or in the East. So that's kind of the hope. But I think I'm actually pretty good at organizing stuff like this, and one of my strengths. And so I think I have a pretty good conception of how to get it done. We just have to basically organize some good conferences that catch a lot of public attention. But I'll tell you, this has caught enormous public attention for the limited amount of advertising we've been doing on it. I mean, people really have become quite fascinated by it. And I don't know what it is. Maybe it's something in the zeitgeist or something like that. I don't know. But it's definitely catching, not just in China and the West. In quarters that I thought would be quite hostile to it, have been a lot less hostile than I thought. So I'm pretty optimistic about it. But basically the next step is to organize some conferences and get a buzz going where everyone wants to go to these conferences, and then they want to do their own. But I'm very confident in it. And I think the other interesting thing about it is there's a million PhDs to be written on this topic that haven't been written yet. And you can't say much. You can't say that about most humanities disciplines these days. I mean, people really are regurgitating stuff. It's descended, I don't want to bash the Western humanities too much, although I could. It's descended into kind of like an XYZ reading of Cinderella, Disney Cinderella. It's got really cringe in the West, the humanities. And what we're offering here is a real research program with potential for archival research, very original interpretations, a lot of translations. This is a lot of meat and potatoes work for academics if they want to get away from the Baudrillardian interpretation of Beauty and the Beast. So I think there's a lot of strengths here, actually. So I'm pretty optimistic. But yeah, I think next step is we need to have some conferences, basically, and get them running. And get them running on autopilot. I don't want to be organizing all of them.
Look, it's a fascinating space to be in. Obviously, the world's changing a lot at the moment, and the liberal era, if you will, I think most people clearly sense that it has run out of steam. That's probably quite a generous way of describing it. And this idea of a post-liberal world is one that opens up not only the requirement for cross-civilizational dialogue, but in a sense will only succeed if the cross-civilizational dialogue is successful itself. All the best with these endeavours. I'm sure it will generate continued interest right across the world. People are looking for ways of reimagining possibilities, and obviously drawing from their past is one way of doing it. Appreciate your time, Philip. It's great chatting, and hope to have you and your co-author on the show again in the not too distant future.
That's great. Thanks so much, Warwick.
If you liked that video, please like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel. If you'd like to see more from TIO, check out the Substack link. Or if you'd like to see more from me, check out my Substack in the description.